Hello, my name is Ivy Hobson, and I, along with the Brown Arts Initiative and Ivy Film Festival, welcome you to a conversation with Brown Arts Initiative's Professor of the Practice in Africana Studies, Yoruba Richen, and historian and author Ruth Feldstein. Tonight's discussion will focus on Yoruba Richen's latest film, How It Feels to Be Free, released in 2021 and based on Ruth Feldstein's book, How It Feels to Be Free, Black Women Entertainers and the Civil Rights Movement, published in 2013. Tonight's guests will answer questions during the later portion of the talk, and we encourage you to submit questions in advance using the Q&A feature. It's now my pleasure to introduce Yoruba Richen and Ruth Feldstein. Hello.
Hello.
So, Yoruba Richen is an award-winning documentary filmmaker whose work has been featured on PBS, MSNBC, FX, New York Times OpDoc, Frontline Digital, The Atlantic, and Field of Vision. Her film, How It Feels to Be Free, premiered on PBS's American Masters in January of 2021. Her other recent films include The New York Times Presents The Killing of Breonna Taylor, currently streaming on Hulu, and The Sit-In, Harry Belafonte hosts The Tonight Show, which is streaming on Peacock. Her previous film, The Green Book Guide to Freedom, was broadcast on the Smithsonian Channel and was nominated for an Emmy. Her films, The New Black and Promised Land, won multiple festival awards before airing on PBS's Independent Lens and POV. Yaruba won the Creative Promise Award at Tribeca All Access and is a Sundance Producers Fellow. She's the 2016 recipient of the Chicken and Egg Breakthrough Filmmaker Award and a Guggenheim Fellow. Yaruba is also the founding director of the documentary program at the Craig Newmark Graduate School of Journalism at CUNY. Hello, how are you?
I am good. So excited to be here tonight, to be in conversation.
Awesome, amazing. And as for our second guest, Ruth Feldstein is a professor of history and American studies at Rutgers Newark. She's the author of Motherhood in Black and White, Race and Sex in American Liberalism from 1930 to 1965, the award-winning book, How It Feels to Be Free, Black Women Entertainers in the Civil Rights Movement, and numerous articles. She's an associate producer of the documentary based on her book, How It Feels to Be Free, which premiered on PBS's American Masters in January of 2021. Her article about Nina Simone was awarded the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Prize, Best Article on Black Women's History. She has also received support for her research from the Schlesinger Library, Radcliffe Institute, the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History, Harvard University, the W.E.B. Du Bois Institute for Afro-American Research, Harvard University, and the American Association for University Women, among others. Welcome, Ms. Feldstein.
Thank you so much, Ivy. It's so good to be here. Thank you all for coming. It's especially good to be back at Brown, which is where I was here for graduate school. And that's something Yoruba and I have in common too, that we both have roots at Brown. So it's nice to be here, even virtually. Thank you so much.
Nice to have you here.
Great.
So without further ado, I'll just turn it over to you two.
Awesome. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, Yoruba. It's nice to see you.
Nice to see you, and nice to, I'm excited to actually have a conversation that's sort of wider than just the subject of the subjects in the film, which I, of course, interviewed you a lot about. And yes, I am a proud Brown undergraduate, and also taught a class here last semester. So Ivy was one of my students, and I had an amazing class where I taught about the African-American experience in documentary filmmaking. So it's really a pleasure to be back. So with that, I wanted to ask you a question, Ruth, that I always get asked when I'm talking about the film, but how did you come up with this idea to write this book about these women in the way that you wrote about these women?
Right, that's a great question. And there are a few ways to answer it. The first is that I came to it through Nina Simone. So she was my entry point. And it was listening and re-listening to the song Mississippi Goddam and thinking about the fact that she wrote the song in 1963, just after the Birmingham church bombing. And 1963 is seen as this landmark. It's the year of the March on Washington. which is such an important moment in histories of civil rights movement. And 1963 is also when Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, which is seen as such an important marker in histories of women's liberation. And yet somehow Nina Simone and this incredibly important song didn't fit into either of those histories. And I was really struck by the way that she defied categorization through her incredible artistry and her politics too. So that is what started getting me thinking about how to tell a story that recovered the voices of women like Nina Simone, who hadn't been heard. Their voices hadn't been heard. And I think it's kind of ironic to talk about voices not being heard when you're talking about incredible vocalists like Nina Simone or Abbey Lincoln, but their voices hadn't been heard as part of the political histories of this period. And so I really wanted to offer a history that expanded the parameters of what we think of as politics by attending to women entertainers and their artistry and what they did on camera, on stage, off camera, away from the stage too. And when we widen those parameters of what we think of as politics, we really see their centrality to two of the most transformative social movements of the 20th century, which is the civil rights movement and women's liberation. So that was a big part of it. I think on a personal level, I was drawn to tell this story because I grew up on stories of my father's activism in the civil rights movement. And it was just something that was always so exciting to me. You know, oh my God, Daddy was at the March on Washington. Daddy spent a month in Alabama during Freedom Summer in 1964. And, you know, he was the hero of those stories. And it wasn't until I got much older and started thinking about the fact that, you know, he was in Alabama the summer of 1964 when my mother was pregnant with me and home with 3 babies, you know, and again, you know, so what happens when we shift the lens away from this male-dominated heroic narrative, and what other kinds of stories and what other kinds of voices can be brought forward? So those are some of the ways I came to this.
Wonderful. Wait, I have a follow-up.
Okay.
Can you talk about how you chose the other women? How you, because what struck me about this book when I read it, and even when I read about it, before I even read the book, but was that you had put these women in a cohort.
Right.
So how did you come to the other women? Because there's
Right. Well, I was looking, well, first of all, you know, it's always interesting to talk to people about this. I don't know if you have found this too, Yaruba, is that everyone has the B list, you know, who should have made it in, who should be in the movie, who's not, you know, who should be in the book, who isn't. So I'm always interested to hear what people think about that and who they think should also be there. I was looking for people for, like you said, a cohort in terms of my parameters for who was included and excluded had to do with what they had in common and also what they didn't have in common. So 5 of them, all but Lena Horne, who's a generation older, came of age in the same general time period, both professionally as artists and politically, late 1950s, early 1960s, and in the same place in New York City. And they were all on some level connected to organized movements for Black freedom. And they knew each other and they knew a lot of the same people and they traveled in the same circles. So I was looking for that, and I kind of came upon that as well in my research. But I also wanted, they're very, very different from each other. Their politics are very different. Their career choices are very different. I really wanted different cultural arenas and venues. So some of them are more famous for TV, some film, some music. In academia, you know, people are so specialized. You know, the jazz people never talk to the TV people, never talk to the film studies people. And I thought it was really important to have that diversity too. And also they're not all American born. So that Miriam Makeba, for example, is South African born. She spent about a decade in the United States and had an enormous impact here. And all of the women I write about too were very, very popular outside of the United States. And this transnational flow of what happens with regards to civil rights in the United States affecting populations abroad, and these women's experiences outside the United States affecting them here, and the choices they make here was important as well. So those were some of my parameters for inclusion and exclusion.
Got it.
Yeah. So can I ask you sort of similar question? Well, for one, Yoruba, what drew you to this topic? But this is the first and I think only film you've made that is adapting a book to screen. And what were the particular challenges you faced in making a film from a book that perhaps you hadn't or haven't faced in other of your projects?
Yeah. So what drew me were, besides all the things that you just laid out, their political work, their diversity of careers, the place in which, you know, their stories took place. I also, as I said, when I read the review of the book when it came out, I think I read the review, I guess that was late 2013, early 2014. And when I read the book, I read the review, even before I read the book, I thought it would make a powerful film because for those reasons, and also the fact that the entertainment industry was being told through these women's eyes, and that we hadn't seen that before, and the evolution of the entertainment industry, and how they each change representation in their own particular time period and field, and how they set up what we see today in terms of talking, conversation, you know, pushes and pulls around diversity in the entertainment industry, and Black women specifically telling their own stories. So I thought it hit all these different things that could actually bring us into a contemporary moment and help us understand what was going on around this conversation, that these, you know, Oscar So White was not the first time that we had been pushing for a better representation in Hollywood. It's been since the beginning of Hollywood. So that's what drew me. And of course, you know, what I added Pam Grier. And I added her because I thought she could help us get into that contemporary space. And also the Blaxploitation was so important also to our time in Hollywood, and also reshaped, and her roles reshaped how African-American women were seen. Mary McCabe is, you know, of course, an amazing artist. And I just had to make some choices. And that leads to your second question about adapting a book. Yes. So in some ways, I think adapting a book actually gives you, as a filmmaker, helps you, because it creates the scope of what you are, of the stories that you're telling. So this is not a biography, right? The book is not a biography. And women, but looked at very particular moments around how they changed the game, how they changed how Black women were seen. So it actually gives you it helps to begin that issue, to address that issue of structure, which is always the issue that you're dealing with in making a film. Challenges were, of course, what to leave out. I mean, there's a lot of stuff in the book that, we weren't able to include. So you're always making that choice. And because there were no interviews with the women themselves in the book, we had to, then figure out really from scratch, what we wanted them. First off, start finding out archive-wise what existed of the women, because I wanted them to tell their own story as much as possible, either through interviews or through archive. And then who would we get to, who could we still get to? And luckily, we were able to interview Diahann Carroll, Pam Grier, Lena Horne's daughter, and could help us fill that out. So I think it actually gives, adapting a book can be very helpful, which is why a lot of filmmakers do it, because it gives you that skeleton of a story.
Mm-hmm. Just something else about adding Pam Grier that I think really enhances the story so much is that Cicely, Tyson, who's in the book and in the movie, and Pam Grier were enormously popular at the same time.
Yes.
And you talk about how Cicely Tyson was very critical of blaxploitation, and I talk about that in the book too. But I don't really give Pam Grier a chance to answer back. And I think it really it messes up the story in really useful ways to realize that here are two women entertainers enormously popular at the same time, again, making different career choices, but both working to represent Black womanhood and to tell their own stories and to carve out space in these industries where they face such significant obstacles. So I think it's great to have them up against each other in this way that, there is no one way to tell this story, and right. that this is going on at the same time. So I really like that for that reason too.
Absolutely. And that's, of course, something we discovered in the film. Like, it's not something I had gone into, knowing, but it was something, as you discover your footage and discover what the interviews are saying and the themes, it's something that came out. So, so that was one of my favorite parts. What were so you mentioned that people always tell you, and it's funny, they would say, when I would tell them about the film before it was made, that they would always say to me, "Oh, but what about so-and-so? What about so-and-so?"
Who yeah.
Yeah.
Who are so-and-so?
Yeah, exactly. But once I made the film, I never get asked that question anymore.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, mm-hmm. Yeah, because people see it as, a complete cohort. But who are some of the other women who were trailblazers, you think, who could have, had their own part in the film? Or
well, the names that come up a lot are Odetta, Eartha Kitt, Dorothy Dandridge. People ask about Aretha Franklin, of course. So those are some of the names that I hear a lot as well. Uh-huh.
Totally. And one person that we actually wanted to try to fit in, and we really didn't. It was, in earlier cuts we had her in a little bit, but it's Josephine Baker as well.
Right.
Well,
if you go back earlier in time too, there's a long these are not the first women like this. There's a long prehistory as well.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I think, you made an interesting point about this not being biography and not being a collective biography. And I think that's just important to think about more too, in that I know that when I was doing the research and, finding these sources and all these people talking about these women when they were first soaring to fame in their respective moments, and each one of them would always get described as like so unique and the only one who this and the first to that. And that's particularly so with regard to hair. At least 4 of the women I write about that talked about in the period that they were famous as the first woman to wear her hair natural. And when I was doing the research at the beginning, I was like, oh, well, was she the first? Like, is she the first? And like looking at the dates of things, and then I realized like, that's a ridiculous question, and that when you get past this like great person way of telling the story, you see that this is a collective at work and that these choices were a form of activism that large groups of women were doing, and that it's not about who's the first, it's the fact that it was happening in all of these different ways in all of these different places. And again, one of the things I think is interesting about the documentary is that it's not organized person by person, and it's not even organized strictly chronologically either. It is, looking at them through certain themes as a loosely connected cohort. So I think that is probably not traditional documentary filmmaking, is it?
Yeah, I thought it was more interesting to do it that way. I never wanted it to be, one story after the other story after the other story, other story. Though, in terms of process, that is, one of the first cuts was that we just laid out the stories and put them side by side, chronologically. But by doing that, you get to see what are the themes that emerge. And that, oh, okay, we could actually organize it a different way. And I think it's much more interesting to organize it more thematically, even though at the same time, you still have to have a chronological move forward, because you starting somewhere, we start in the 40s and we do get to today. So you still have to, figure out, it was definitely I would say, it was definitely a hard nut to crack structurally. It was, yeah, every film is tough. But this one, I was like, humph, I'm not, I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. I'm not there yet. And of course, I had an amazing production team and editors and producers who helped me get there. Part of it was quarantining. The production, happened up in Canada because those were our producers. And we worked virtually, of course, most of the time. But then for the last, after we had done a couple cuts, it became clear that we just all needed to be together. And we had a very tight deadline, so it would be faster for us to work together, the editors and me. And so quarantining, in Canada, you have to quarantine for 2 weeks when you arrive, can't, leave the house. And then after that, I was able to work with a week with the editors. But those 2 weeks, I was, storyboarding on the wall, moving stuff around, trying to figure out, and that was like the breakthrough during those 2 weeks. So quarantine can be useful to push you to artistic breakthrough. But I did want to say exactly about the first, because I remember one of our early conversations, you had brought that up, and also about the first TV show because of Diahann Carroll, right? And being cautious about saying she was the first African-American to have her own, female to have her own TV show, because she wasn't the first to have to not play a maid. She wasn't. As we know, Hazel Scott was actually the first, or we think, I mean, there could be even a first before that we don't know, but being very careful about those terms of the first. And it does, take away from, right, these movements were all happening. And they're all building on each other in terms of their work. And I also just want to say, in terms of the biography, the thing that I've been frustrated with a lot of the biographies of our entertainers is that, and we talked about this too, is that the tendency is to focus on the tragedy. Yeah. Is to focus on the pain and the tragedy, which, it's fine. I'm not saying that, though these artists don't, or that's not a part of it, but it can tend to obscure the genius and the legacy. And that's really was also a motivating factor for me in wanting to tell the story in this way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I made the same choice in terms of not delving into these women's, their personal lives. Not that that's not interesting and important, doesn't merit attention, but for the same reason. And especially since they all worked so hard in their own lives to represent themselves in certain ways, that I really wanted to respect that and acknowledge that as well as you do in the film. I had another question, Yaruba. You talked about the making and the final push happening in the context of COVID and the quarantine. You also were working on this film in the context of a resurgent Me Too movement and this past year's racial protests. And I wonder how you think that affected your thinking about the film or your work on it or choices you made in any way.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a theory that films come out. So this one was a long haul, as you know. It took 5 years to 5-6 years from idea to broadcast. And that can often be the journey of a documentary. It's we have to raise the money, we have to all the things have to line up in place. And but the film just got more and more relevant as those years went by. So even, in 2014, I think that was the beginning of the 2015, the beginning of the Oscar So White campaign, right? And here I was trying to tell a story about these women that were, the original Oscar Academy TV studio So White, right? And then, of course, Me Too actually happened after that, and we see how these, these roles, the limitation that these women had, the breakthrough that they made, and the limitation that they had as Black women specifically, facing an industry and in an industry and pushing against an industry that was, literally built on racism and sexism. So it actually got, more and more relevant, and had always wanted to bring in a new the contemporary what was going on today in the industry, but also too, who were we going to interview about this? So like Lena Waithe, for example, is someone, we didn't know who she was when we started, but when we were looking for who are these Black women creators that are literally changing the game, she was one of the people that we knew we wanted to reach out to. So even the people that we decided to interview, shifted and changed as the years went on. But I always felt, and we always felt as a team, that this was, that this was incredibly relevant. And again, it just got more relevant through through the years.
Yeah, and it's interesting too to think about both Me Too and Black Lives Matter protests. I feel like a lot of people, Me Too became so associated with prominent white women actresses and performers that so many people forget that a Black woman activist, Tarana Burke, started Me Too years before, it became associated with white women performers. And similarly with Black Lives Matter, I think a lot of people don't know that, Black women started Black Lives Matter too. So this erasure of Black women's contributions to these movements is another kind of extension of the story you're telling in the film as well. And the importance of giving women their, listening to their voices, giving them space to tell their own stories, both the women from the past who you recover in the film, and the women from the present whose voices are just so wonderful and really, add so much. I was going to ask you, was there a list of, who didn't make it in from the more contemporary group as well?
Well, there's certainly people that we were, reached out to that, sometimes you just don't hear from people. I'm trying to think. I mean, we did actually, the real person that we really, wanted to interview, and I did end up meeting her, but we were not able to, arrange the interview, unfortunately. And then she passed, is Cicely Tyson, who, was lovely when I met her, really supportive of the project. She was finishing her book, which came out, and then she passed, I think, in the next week. So I think now, I actually think we have the right amount of voices in terms of the contemporary actresses and creators of today. I really do. But I was going to say that, was there anything as the author of the book that you felt you wish could have made it in there that was not in there? I get asked this question all the time too, so that's why
that's an interesting question. I'm going to flip it and just say that, the footage that you guys found was so incredible. And a lot of it I had seen over the course of my research, but some of it I hadn't seen. And so just to give one example, I'd done a lot of work on Abbey Lincoln and what happened. She was a jazz singer who came out with this album that had a lot of political jazz music, and one of the most prominent jazz critics of the time offered this scathing review of her, indicting her for being a professional Negro and overplaying her negritude, I think he said. And this caused a lot of controversy. And then there was this whole symposium on racial prejudice in jazz where she and her husband, Max Roach, and this jazz critic and others all met. And I had read about this and I had read the transcripts, but I had never heard and seen the footage that you have. And that was just one of those moments in the film where I was just blown away, and where you just realize that no matter how deeply you immerse yourself in written text and those kinds of archives, the visual and the oral are just tell a whole different story. And that was just such a rich moment.
Absolutely. And that's back to your question about the challenges around a book. So as I said, it helps to give you that spine, and that you wrote about in the book, right? That moment.
Mm-hmm.
So I knew that it was a moment that we wanted to talk about in the film. And then it was the archivist, the amazing archivist that we had. And as I said, we were, based in, the production came out of Toronto. So it was CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Company footage that she found.
Oh, wow.
That's how we found that.
That's incredible.
Incredible, right? We did not know that existed. Another instance where we actually didn't find the footage, but I wanted to find a way to bring it alive, was the the hearings that Adam Clayton Powell held on racism in the entertainment industry in 61, I believe. So again, long history of this, of us advocating around this issue, and of Black entertainers advocating around this issue. Now, what's amazing to me is that footage there appears to be no footage or no audio. So this is in 1960. They had some of the biggest Black stars at the time testifying: Sidney Poitier, Diahann Carroll, Abbey Lincoln, and others, held by Adam Clayton Powell, a very powerful, representative. And it wasn't taped. There's no footage. And that can be some of the challenges with telling our history as well, archival wise, footage wise. There can be things that you think would be, that would have been interest from newspapers, from, TV stations, they ignored.
Yeah. It poses particular challenges to tell a history when part of the history you're telling is about erasure. So
exactly.
I remember when I first started working on this, and I saw an old colleague, and she said, "What are you working on?" I said, "I'm doing research on Nina Simone," and she said, "Oh, where are her papers?" And I was like, if only, it just doesn't work like that.
Exactly.
And how you find things in these interstitial spaces, and you really have to think, in those kinds of creative ways to find the materials.
And actually, it's something that I'm thinking about for my future work, the kind of problems with the archive.
Mm-hmm.
And how to as a filmmaker that is interested in these stories and just shining a light on these kinds of stories, how can we be creative in telling that? And there's there's definitely some interesting approaches people are taking in terms of visually, filling that in. But I had also I asked you about footage, stuff that's not in there that you would have liked to see. For me, some of the things that we had to, that we couldn't include were some biographical information that, we tried. So like, with Lena Horne, for example. I mean, Lena Horne her story really in some ways became the longest because she was so trailblazing, and everything that she was doing, really hit all the themes that we were talking about for the most part. But, we couldn't include some of the biography around her. Even the fact that it's not necessarily biography, but like her pinup girl years, she was a pinup girl for these African-American soldiers in World War II, which was really, which was really a big deal for them to have their own Black pinup girl. But another one that I point out, and it's not, as deep, but I love the dynasty footage of Diahann, and there's, she's, it's just so delicious, so amazing to watch. I mean, that's the other reason why I wanted to do this film, by the way, going back to the first question, is because they're amazing performers. And I knew that we could have the audience, the viewers would be watching, these amazing performances. But there's so much good stuff in the dynasty footage, and we really pushed as much as possible to include more of her delicious scenes, and for reasons of budget and for we couldn't, but I would love to have included more of her.
Yeah, and that makes me think of one other thing that I would have loved to see is more of Abbey Lincoln and Sidney Poitier together in For Love of Ivy.
That's right.
Especially some of their bedroom scenes, which was also so groundbreaking.
Totally. Yep. That is one section. Yeah, that's right. That we actually had in and had to what weren't able to include. So we do have a question. So please, again, we encourage you to answer questions in to ask questions in the chat. This is from one person in the audience. So both in general and with the Grammys coming up this weekend, do either of you see change or progress in the music industry, or how it still mirrors the past? So I'll start. I'm not an expert in the music industry, but from what I see, I think, and this is even more general, I think one of the things that has empowered audiences is that they are able to control their own media in some way. So social media obviously is a big part of that, being able to create their, have more ownership over their brand. I mean, can you imagine if Lena Horne had Twitter and Instagram, and what she and what she would able to have put out there as who she wanted to be, as the kind of actress she wanted to be. So I think musicians, I think that's the same for musicians. And also with the sort of implosion of the industry, right? You have many musicians who are not dependent on labels, who, are not dependent on the radio, as we talked about in the film. Some Nina Simone songs were banned, like For Women, because it was too radical. Again, she could have put that out on YouTube, right? And had and created, a video and put it out to her fans and to her people. So I think that has given a lot of agency to artists, which is good.
Yeah. And I see another question. Speak to your relationship with each other through this project. Did you know each other before? Did you develop a collaborative relationship? How did that evolve? So I'll start that one, and you can jump in, Yaruba. So as Yaruba said, when the book first came out and started to get reviews, I got a number of calls from filmmakers who were interested in turning the book into a documentary, actually. And I met with Yaruba, and as we spent time together and talked, including about our shared history at Brown, for that matter, I came, as we talked more and as I saw your work, I realized right away that you were the person who I wanted to, entrust this material to, and I could not have made a better decision. So I just feel extremely, extremely lucky to have had Yaruba as the director and the whole production team who throughout have treated this material with such respect and care and love. And I have colleagues who have had their work, who have sort of turned their work over to documentary filmmakers, and they have felt very, very cut out. It's like, okay, that's it. And, that's all. We don't really want to hear from you ever again after that. And that's not been my experience at all. So I feel very, very lucky. And I think that one of the things that, made me know that this was the right choice was I felt I could tell you, but that you, again, weren't looking to tie the story up with a neat bow. Like you told messy stories, and you told them beautifully and coherently and in visually interesting ways, but would not overly simplify it, and that you could really attend to the intersections of gender and race that were important to the story in a really accessible, interesting, and meaningful way. So again, I feel very, very grateful and appreciative of the collaboration.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for entrusting me with the story, the stories. Yeah, I mean, I think that, as I said, we were the journey of the film is that, we were able to um, uh, get some development money after, Ruth and I agreed to work together, get some development money, and create a couple of trailers that we shared with you, Ruth, to get, got your feedback. Also, thinking about even just contacts of some of the people that, sharing that as we were trying to reach out to, Cicely, Tyson. Checking, especially towards the end, I remember I was emailing you, hey, is this correct? Are we saying this? And for those kinds of things. So yeah, I think it was a real, I think Ruth did really trust us as the production team and allowed us to be able to take that creative leap and figure out how we were going to tell this story. Because also as a filmmaker, you need that too, right? You need to be able to figure that out. How is this story going to be told? But I love, to me, what I love about documentary filmmaking is the collaboration. Like that's the, on the production side, on the idea side. I feel like everybody brings their, their best game, at least in the way that the sort of ideal, when it's working ideally. And so I love that brain power and that artistic power that happens in documentary filmmaking. I think it's why I do it.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Cicely, Tyson, Yaruba, and I just want to take a moment to just say too, sort of the poignancy and the pain also, and the sadness of this film coming out, and celebrating her and acknowledging her importance just around the time of her passing. And, yes, she was 96, and yes, she lived a long, full life. And it's still really, really, really sad that after decades and decades of her making such critical contributions for so long, to have had her die. But I also just want to say that I feel like it makes the sections on her that much more powerful and that much more important. And you've done this incredible work of preservation and recuperation. And if as a result of this film, a new generation learns about Cicely Tyson and goes out and watches Sounder and sees her other work, then that will be a tremendous gift. And, again, I really do believe that the world is in a much better place for her having been in it for so long. So I just think it deserves mention in particular.
Totally. Absolutely. If you have more questions, please post them in the Q&A. That reminded me of something I was going to say, but then I just got this question, so I'll answer that. How did you deal with any difficulties finding archival still and images that you couldn't get licensing or couldn't find? So archive is like a whole nother talk. So one of the things that happened in the journey to making this film is that when I started working on this in 2014, I had never made an archival film before. I had never, my previous two films were verite. They were not, they were contemporary stories. So in the course of making the journey of bringing this film to life, I say it's 5 years, but it's obviously not. I'm working on it every day for 5 years. I'm working on other projects. working on other films. And I ended up making 2 archival films during that journey. So the first was The Green Book, Guide to Freedom, about the travel guide that African Americans used and was created to help them navigate terrorism on the roads. And a film that came out this year called Harry Belafonte hosts The Tonight Show, which is about the week in '68 that Harry Belafonte took over the Tonight Show from Johnny Carson as the country and the world was kind of exploding. So I got a lot of, so that really prepped me for How It Feels to Be Free, which is also the longest film I've ever made, has the most archival I've ever had to deal with. And one of the things that you have to do is you have to keep looking. So even when you think that there's no footage, you have to keep looking. You do that, one of the first things that we did with the development money is bring in an archive producer, and who specializes in looking for images and footage, and that helps us to understand the world in which we're living in terms of what exists. And the first is we want archive of like all the women, right? What is it they say from the time periods that we're looking for. And luckily, starting in the 60s, especially in 70s and 80s, these women there was a lot of archive of these women. Lena Horne was, arguably, the most famous African-American actress, singer at that time, so she was interviewed a lot, and her story, she was telling her story. Diahann Carroll was telling their story. Abbey Lincoln was telling, even though not as famous and well known, but was telling their story, and about their experience in the industry. So it was really bringing those interviews together and seeing what they say. And in terms of the other thing, though, about archive, and this may be what you were asking about licensing, archive can be very expensive. In some ways, these companies that own this material are holding our history hostage financially because it's really, really expensive. So there's what more and more documentarians and other folks are doing is relying on something called fair use, which is certain criteria in terms of how you're using the archive in the film to argue that that this is public domain, that you should not have to pay for it. And the sort of most obvious, and How It Feels to Be Free meets a lot of these criteria because we're commenting on the footage. So when we see Diahann Carroll and Julia, and we hear, that she was critiqued for also playing this role because it was, in 1968, and it wasn't a militant, it was a middle-class Black woman, and we're seeing that footage, we can make an argument that, this is public domain because we're commenting on it. We're not just using the footage like willy-nilly. So anyway, it's fair use is a whole thing, but very important in order to bypass licensing and budget issues that you can have.
So just as a follow-up to that, were there any clips that you weren't able to find a way to use because of, economic or other issues that just had to get left out?
Yeah, there's a Nina Simone, there's a concert of Nina Simone's that is owned by a French company, and I believe it's the Save Me, her singing Save Me. But we had to, we couldn't afford it. We knew we weren't going to be able to fair use it because it did meet that criteria, and we couldn't afford it. There's also a lot of stuff we had to switch out, and luckily we had an archivist who could help us, who is budgeting, as we were going along. And so for another example is, I believe it was a Lena Horne clip. Yeah, so Lena Horne, after we tell the story of her being blacklisted, and then she resurrects her career, right? And then we had this great footage of her coming out. I forget where it's from, but coming out and singing. And, you know, the archivist for this, that's going to cost X amount of dollars. Can you switch it in and use this, which it's going to be cheaper. So you're doing all that kind of thing. You're doing all those things throughout because, you know, the budget is so important.
Here's a question. Did this work spark any new or future projects? There seems to be so many places you could go from here. I'm curious to know if there's any lingering inspiration that you hope to carry forward.
So Ruth, why don't you answer that first?
There are definitely a number of things. I mean, one thing that strikes me as really interesting is thinking about, I mean, Cicely Tyson wrote her memoir that again just came out a week before she died. There are no full-length biographies of Cicely Tyson out there, which seems remarkable to me. And it's a gap waiting to be filled. So that is one place I'd like to go.
Interesting. Yeah. And, you know, on that note, there are also no full, I mean, you know, people also said as well, each of these women can have their own,
right. Their own biography.
Yeah, exactly. So there is that. I think, you know, there are other entertainers whose stories I think are really interesting, which, you know, this has made me think about as well. Right now, I'm, you know, personally working on some new projects and taking some time to think about what is the next one, you know, that I want to do, initiate, and, you know, spend another 5 years. Now, hopefully it won't take another 5 years, but spend, you know, that time and energy to get done.
Question for you, Yaruba. What are some of your favorite documentaries, or ones that have had the biggest impact on you, which may or may not be the same thing?
Right. So there's so many favorite films that I have that have impacted me in different ways. So I think of a very early film of Stanley Nelson, which I think was one of the first documentaries I ever saw, about Madam C.J. Walker. And it really opened my eyes up to what documentary could do. Of course, Madam C.J. Walker was the first female millionaire, Black woman, hair, you know, who created a hair care business and kind of revolutionized the way Black women did their hair and were in business. So that really opened my eyes up. And again, I saw that when I was very young. Couple of my favorite films one of my favorite is from a filmmaker who passed recently, unfortunately, but he was a co-director on a film called The Weather Underground. And it's about the radical whites organization in the 1960s. And to me, that film was so amazing because it really opened my eyes and so many to, you know, it's like, wow, I had no idea about this. And it was so recent, right? Like it literally was just like in the 60s that there was this radical white kind of the Black Panther, like you know, they were inspired to organize white people as the Black Panthers had organized, and incredible footage. And so that's one of my favorite docs. You know, there's some recent ones that just came out. I think the MLK FBI film is really powerful. Sam Pollard. There's a film, a PBS film about Malcolm X that I think is really, you know, a really comprehensive look at his life, called Make It Plain. I mean, there's so many different kinds of films,
right?
You know, that I think are amazing. So it's hard for me to choose just one. Any other questions?
Yeah, it looks like we have time for one more, if anyone has.
Anyone have one? I'm trying to think. You know, when I get that question, I feel like I'm always leaving something out.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to. Yeah.
What about
anyone be angry at you if we're?
Yeah, of course, exactly. What about projects that you're, since doesn't look like we have any questions,
Mhm.
do you want to share, just briefly share your journey from Brown to where you are to being an
Oh,
award-winning author?
yeah, so I finished my PhD at Brown, and then
And what did you, what was
I
your,
was in the history department, which I think has changed a lot since I was there. And I did a lot in American studies, even though I was in the history department, and always very interested in more interdisciplinary work. And when I finished, I worked at Harvard for a number of years and then moved to Rutgers University, which has been wonderful. They were getting an American Studies PhD program off the ground. They were just launching their first PhD program on the campus. And so I came on board to help get that going, and have been there for about 10 years now. It's a really wonderful institution. So that's been my journey.
cool.
Mhm.
And briefly, I'll just say, so at Brown, I was a theater and political science major. So I did a lot of theater and graduated, uh, did not, did not see documentary as a viable career, even though I loved it, until really like the mid 90s when the cameras started to get smaller and it felt, really like when the home consumer cameras came out. And then I made a couple of videos. I was living in California. I made a couple of short documentaries for classes, really, and then decided that I wanted to try and do this, and moved back to New York and worked my way up the sort of food chain, with great mentors, who helped me along the way. I went over to the news side for a little bit. I worked at ABC News in the investigative unit. And then I started making my first film in 2004. That took 5 years. and then kind of once you make your first film and then you start making your next one, that's, then you're a documentary filmmaker. So I really had, and I didn't major in film in school or journalism. We didn't have a journalism department at Brown. But I do feel like the thing that being able to take, a plethora of classes in undergrad of things that just interested me. And, they say documentary filmmakers, journalists, you need to know a little bit about a lot of different things. And that's, what I feel I was able to do in terms of like just pursue my interests at Brown, and be guided by, where my interest was. And also this foundation in theater and in storytelling. So I feel like that's how I got to make to the documentary world.
And one other piece, just to come full circle back to the roots at Brown, is that I think that from my years at Brown, I really learned the critical importance of collaboration. And I think, an undergraduate and also in the graduate programs, I really, I couldn't have done it without being part of a group, without being part of a cohort myself, and at an institution that really encouraged collaboration, and that's something that's been important to me throughout. And I think this sort of myth of, the isolated academic and the Ivy Tower has never applied for me. And I've always valued that kind of dialogue and collaboration, starting from graduate school at Brown and through this project working with Yaruba. So.
Awesome. Well, wonderful to talk with you.
Thank you everyone for being here and for your great questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much. And Brown, thank you for BAI. Thank you for hosting us.
Yes. Have a good night, everybody.
Have a good night. Stay safe.